Lifestyle with Allan T.
I've got my first guest on this afternoon. Her name is Jana Bakunina. Now, she's a writer of The Good Russian. Now, Russia-Ukraine memoir. That is what this is all about. It's a unique and necessary book. The Good Russian takes us inside wartime Russia to a city that Jana knows intimately. I'd like to welcome you on the line now. Jana, good day to you.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, you bring us face to face with ordinary Russians and also telling us your own compelling personal story. Best of all, you write very well. Simon Cooper, Financial Times and author of the best-selling Chums, a powerful and deeply personal exploration of what it means to be Russian today, from a writer seeking to understand her own country after its slide into authoritarianism. But hasn't Russia always been under authoritarianism, even the Tsar's days and the Soviet Union? It's not really got out of it, has it, really? Anyway, tell us your story.
Well, we did have some democracies.
A bit, yeah.
Yes. Well, anyway. But, I was brought up in Yekaterinburg, which is third or fourth largest city in Russia, certainly after Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's about 2 hours flight from Moscow to the east, or if you prefer train, that would be 20 hours on a fast train.
Oh, right, Yekaterinburg. I now recognize the title. Thank you. I was looking at it and I was pronouncing it incorrectly, but yes, of course. Carry on.
I mean, sort of infamous for being the place where the last Russian Tsar was and his family were murdered, of course,
exactly.
in 1918. And so, when I was growing up, so I was basically growing up in the times of perestroika and glasnost, which means openness. And so it was a very exciting time. I mean, you have to imagine that it was, it was tough, of course, in terms of, severe shortages and sort of in terms of livelihood. But it was also exciting because suddenly we had kind of all these opportunities to peek into the West. And I think at that time, Russia, at least among sort of people like my parents, sort of intelligentsia, was very much westward focused. And so I learned English at school from the age of 6. I then also learned German. So the sort of direction of travel was very much to the West. Europe. And so and eventually I ended up in Britain, where I lived since 1999. So that sort of roughly coincides with the rule of Vladimir Putin. So I have never lived in Russia with him in charge. And, as I was kind of trying to get on in Europe, things were happening in Russia. And I think like many Russians or many immigrants who are sort of trying to just get settled in the new country, I sort of wasn't paying a very detailed attention to what was happening. And so eventually when Russia, for example, annexed the Crimea, and it became sort of impossible not to look back and start talking, it became apparent that I have, we have sort of missed the time. And I think that also implies kind of to the West collectively, because if I gave you an argument, where were sort of European leaders or the US leaders in time where Russia had annexed the Crimea? So if we maybe acted more decisively here in Europe, we wouldn't be in a sort of 3.5 year, Russia wouldn't be in a 3.5 year war with the Ukraine.
It's interesting contrast, because I actually got to know some people in Georgia, including Saakashvili, the then president, through a cultural exchange, and apparently they parked these American aircraft in Tbilisi airport when Putin invaded Georgia, and he basically pulled back. And they say that a similar situation could have developed with Crimea had the American administration actually looked at it in the same way. But of course, it was Barack Obama, incredible. He's a great great president. But as you quite rightly say, things didn't quite go the way they could have done had the West shown a little bit more concern about this development. And as you quite rightly say now, the Crimea debacle and what has happened since gave Putin a lot more latitude. Wouldn't you agree? Now, you decided to return to your hometown, where you were born, and you said that you felt furious, ashamed, but most of all, helpless. Yes, so I think it was during the full-scale invasion, the first days, weeks even. Many people like me, sort of liberal-minded Russians, if I can put it this way. Sure. We felt completely helpless because we knew what was going on in Russia. We knew that people could not go out and protest there because they were immediately arrested and beaten up, treated very badly, in sort of by the authorities. And there was very little we could do. But then, at some point, I had that idea that maybe I could go to Russia and actually speak to ordinary people. Mm-hmm. So in the time where very, very few international journalists are actually in Russia, to give you a BBC example, they used to have a team of like 100 there in Moscow, and now it's 6 people, including everyone. So not just the journalists, but kind of like everyone. That's the team in Moscow. And so my idea was to go to Russia and speak to ordinary people, not kind of, not the rich, not the poor, but just ordinary kind of man and woman in the street, so to speak. Yes, with kids, be it small children or grown-up kids, and kind of see, well, how do they live? How do they get on? What are their fears? And maybe, I also spoke, of course, to people who were very happy with everything in Russia, with the regime and with the prospects for their children. And so, and ultimately, of course, I chose to speak to people who trusted me and which were my friends, people that I grew up with, because I think that was really only possible to have this sort of extended, very candid conversations based on mutual trust. And I should point out, changed the names and the identities of those people for the book. I was going to ask you the question of, did you face any issues with the authorities when you were there, even though you are natural-born Russian, of course? Yeah, well, fortunately not. I'm speaking to you right now. Indeed you are. Well, obviously, you were able to, but you were quite surprised in some respects what you found, weren't you? I was surprised. I think we sort of, we live in a world where we are sort of aware of the situations maybe of where war is going on, and news reporting is usually very sort of sensationalist. Of course, it focuses on conflict of any war. But we also know that, in fact, people just get on with lives. And so when I went to Yekaterinburg, life was very much business as usual. Really? Right. It was thriving. I mean, the streets where I've actually visited, well, not where you are, but I've been to Valencia. In fact, Valencia is not far from here. Yes, and so Yekaterinburg is a lot cleaner than Valencia, for example. Really? So it's very well developed. It's at least in the center. The restaurants are completely full. You can have whatever you want. You can have an Aperol Spritz. You can have Spanish Rioja. You could, like everything is possible. It just takes sort of a different route to Russia and maybe costs a little bit more. Now, sorry, carry on. Yes, so I think from that point of view, of course, because we are thinking like, well, that's the country at war. But in fact, the government and I guess people and businesses in sort of complicity with the government have sort of decided that the war is not part of their lives. And so you would be really hard pressed to find any evidence of the war going on, apart from maybe, some posters advertising sort of contracts where you could sign up and get very well paid
to go and fight. And even on television, in terms of, everything now is really belongs to the government in terms of like
media
right?
and so sure.
And so even there, so when they cover the war, they're very careful. They're sort of making it look like it's just drone strikes. They use kind of like a plane where nothing's happening and some kind of random drone is there. So they certainly don't show any kind of attacks.
Right, yeah. The actual sort of infantry attacking. What I was going to ask you is, when did you actually return? Was it recently or was it a few years ago?
So this is a good question because I was there 2 years ago and I came.
So the war had started just about,
Oh no! So
was it just before the war, or before they actually attacked Ukraine, not the Crimea?
No. So after the war,
Was it started? Yes, it could be 2 years. Yeah, gosh.
Yes, and so I thought, well, I have to, I better write this up really quickly because while it's still relevant, because
sure.
What if the war ends? What if I don't know, but that's the thing. So 2 years on, it's as if I've written this, yesterday.
Wow.
So nothing whatsoever have changed. I mean, you see on the news there are peace talks or pretension at peace talks. In fact, nothing is happening, and people are dying in Ukraine.
I know. Don't take me there on a discussion. I have a certain opinion and a view which wouldn't make Mr. Trump very happy, so we won't go there. The other thing is the fact that you found, as I say, people were just getting on with their lives, and they're still getting on with their lives. It's even affected your immediate family, hasn't it, in that respect?
Yes. Well, it's. Unfortunately, I'm finding myself sort of at odds in terms of thinking with my father.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is very sad because my father was actually one of those enthusiasts in terms of perestroika and being open to the Western opportunities. But that's just a very good example of what propaganda can do and does. So if you have 25 years to bombard someone with morning and evening news day in, day out, you get people who, simply would have an opinion very much aligned with the government. And, of course, there are some other kind of, personal, I suppose, circumstances that play into it. So, in Russia, people really suffered then in the 1990s where, everything was very chaotic. A lot of people lost their jobs. It was, it was hard. And so I think that generation who went through all of that, they simply sort of appreciate the stability that Putin has given them. And, I spoke to people, and that's in the book, who are saying, well, he's done well for the economy. Now, whether it's up to him or the fortunate rise in oil prices, that's another story. But if I can trust him with economics, why can't I trust him in foreign affairs? Mm-hmm. So that's the view of people, not old, but actually, people in their 30s and 40s.
The underlying sort of situation with people who maybe previously were very liberal in their thinking is out of necessity, would you think, to a certain extent? They say, well, I can't really go against this regime. So let's just sort of keep my real thoughts to myself and just go along with it. I mean, I can understand why people do that.
I think I'm laughing because I'm thinking I probably have written this book mainly to answer this question. And so it's very difficult to answer it in one sentence because in truth, many people have their own reasons. And sometimes it's the way people were brought up. And sometimes it's kind of life circumstances. But ultimately it's individual. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that people who are reading this book here in the West, they can read into it and see that we have a lot more in common then the way we're different.
Yeah,
Just in sort of preparation for this conversation, I had a look at some stats, which is basically from this, what used to be an independent pollster in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're still independent. They're not owned by the government, but they are called sort of foreign agent, which basically means that, they receive some outside funding. And so when they come to you in the street and say, what do you think of Putin? Mm-hmm. They have to say, by the way, I'm a foreign agent. What do you think of Putin? So there is some sort of caveat in terms of accuracy of their polling. But, so I had a look at the polling for November, where people were asked to point out what the most acute problems that they have right now. Mm-hmm. And 59% of people said that it's inflation.
Yes, so I can imagine. Yeah. It's the economy. It is the economy. It must be suffering dramatically at the moment.
Well, exactly. And sort of, rise in the pension age, again, something that we, can very much relate to here in Europe. Livelihood, and even 25% pointed out that migrants are a problem in Russia. And so
I was reading. Actually, I didn't reading. I was actually listening to my predecessor on the station today, Stephen Ritson. He does a duo called Europe Today, and it's a lot of political discussion. And he was saying that now you can become a Russian citizen if you want to sort of come to Russia, but you have to join the army. And you won't be sort of being putting at a military base 1,000 miles from the Ukraine. You'll probably be on the front line, and you said next to the North Koreans. Looking at it quite flippantly, but I mean, obviously, seriously, they're looking for people to come and fight on their side. And all we hear is that they are obviously using foreign forces, as we know from the North Koreans' perspective, and it's not going that well. And as you rightly say, there's a lot of activity on the ground, but the Russians are not seeing that, because obviously everything that's been shown is drone attacks on Kyiv and so on and so forth. But what you're saying here, and it's fascinating because obviously you've seen how life is going on in your city, but at the same time you must be grappling with this universal problem. What happens when a country you love becomes infected by nationalism? What hope is there when voices of conscience are silenced by dictatorship? And can Russians in exile still imagine a liberated future? And it's all in your book.
Well, yes. I mean, I think these are some of those questions are probably just need to be asked, and
indeed,
and whether we have the answers to all those questions, that's another question. But I hope that I've sort of tried to grapple with all those questions.
Sure.
Like, what does it mean to be Russian, for example?
Sure.
And what does it mean for Russian culture and the Russian language? And is there any hope at all, actually, for those of us who oppose the regime, who don't think we can go back to Russia?
It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Jana, on a very, very sort of difficult and emotive subject. Jana Bakunina. The book is called The Good Russian. I could talk for hours with you about this because it's a fascinating subject, and I appreciate your time today. So go to our book page at TRE.radio, and you can find all the information about the book, The Good Russian by Jana. Thank you so much for talking to us today, and I having sort of met you and looking at you and sort of hearing you. As I say, I have strong views about what is happening at the moment. All these so-called peace plans seem to me like nonsense. And it's disturbing what is happening in the Western world, let alone what is happening in the East. And we just have to face these situations the best way we can and get on with our lives, as you quite rightly said. People in Russia will be getting on with their lives because what's the alternative? You just can't stop. You have to keep going. And that's what you're saying here.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you very much for having me. And as I said, I hope that I just am helping somehow for ordinary Russian people's voices to be heard.
I thank you very much, Jana, for joining us today on Talk Radio, and I wish you well and a lot of success with the book. I'm fascinated to read more. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That's all I can say. Thank you indeed.